The dog hit the lobby doors so hard they bounced off their hinges. 110 pounds of German Shepherd, teeth out, eyes locked, and every single person in that waiting room froze like they'd been nailed to the floor. A child screamed somewhere near the vending machines. A security guard reached for his radio and dropped it. The dog wasn't barking. That was the worst part. It was completely, terrifyingly silent, just standing over the collapsed body of a man in a military jacket, daring anyone to take one step closer. Outside, 3 vehicles with federal plates had just turned into the hospital parking lot. Nobody inside Hargrove Memorial Medical Center knew what was coming. They only knew that a nurse named Olivia Shen was finishing the worst shift of her month, that a man was dying on the lobby floor, and that the dog standing between him and help wasn't going to move for anyone who didn't know the right word. If this story already has you on edge, you're exactly where I want you. Subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. Chasham. The day had started the way most of Olivia's days started at Hargrove Memorial, with someone treating her like she wasn't quite worth the full sentence. Shen. Dr. Marcus Holt didn't look up from his tablet when he said her name. He said it the way you'd say next at a deli counter. Room 4 needs vitals redone. The other nurse did them wrong. Olivia didn't ask which nurse or how he knew. She just went to room 4. She was 32 years old, medium height, the kind of person who could stand in a room for 10 minutes before people registered she was there. Her dark hair was always pulled back tight because loose hair in an ER was an invitation for disaster. She had a small scar along her left jawline that she'd stopped explaining years ago. She wasn't cold exactly. She laughed at things that were funny. She remembered patients' names and their kids' names and the names of their dogs, but she had a quality that people in authority consistently misread as passivity. It wasn't passivity, it was patience. There's a difference, and most people only understand it in hindsight. She'd been at Hargrove Memorial for 2 years, which in this particular ER made her mid-tenure. Staff turned over fast here. The hospital sat in Delwood, a mid-sized Colorado city that had grown faster than its infrastructure and now had 2 competing urgent care chains, one overwhelmed county hospital and Hargrove Memorial, private, well-funded, and run with the particular brand of polished dysfunction that came from prioritizing appearances over outcomes. The administration wing was on the 4th floor. The ER was in the basement. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Olivia redid the vitals in room 4. The patient, an older man named Gerald with a heart that was doing something irregular, watched her work with the careful attention of someone who'd been sick enough times to know the difference between a nurse going through motions and one actually paying attention. "You're the 3rd one today," he said. "I know. I'm sorry about that. You're the first one who checked both arms." She didn't say anything to that. She noted the discrepancy. Left arm reading 15 points lower than the right, which mattered, and flagged it in the chart with a detailed note that she was fairly certain Dr. Holt would skim over in approximately 4 seconds. She was right. She always was. That was also something people misread about her. The situation in the ER that afternoon had a particular texture to it, the kind that experienced nurses recognized as a pressure system building. Not one catastrophic thing, but 5 medium bad things stacking up, each one making the next one worse. Bay 3 had a sepsis patient who'd come in presenting as a UTI and was now looking like something significantly more serious. Bay 6 had a toddler with a fever that wasn't responding to anything the attending ordered. The trauma bay was on standby for a car accident 40 minutes out. The charge nurse, Pauline, had called in sick, which meant her responsibilities had diffused across the remaining staff like a slow-moving spill. And then there was the situation with Derek Malloy. Malloy was Hargrove Memorial's Vice President of Clinical Operations. His official title was longer than that, but VP of Clinical Operations was how he signed emails, and how his nameplate read, and how he introduced himself at meetings with a slight forward lean that communicated he expected you to be impressed. He was 51, silver-haired, and had the particular confidence of a man who had held institutional power long enough to have forgotten that it wasn't a personal quality. He came down to the ER at 3:47 p.m., which was unusual. Administration didn't come down to the ER unless something had gone wrong publicly enough to require visible management. Olivia saw him come through the doors and felt the shift in the room, the way the residents straightened slightly, and the nurses found things to be busy with. She was standing at the medication station, double-checking a dosage order that had come through with a decimal point in the wrong place, and she didn't straighten or find something to be busy with. Malloy was heading toward the sepsis patient in Bay 3. Olivia watched him pass, then looked back at the medication order. The decimal point was still wrong. She corrected it and flagged it for the pharmacist. She found out what Malloy had come down for about 6 minutes later. He was standing in the doorway of the sepsis bay with Dr. Anita Ferris, one of the ER attendings. And from 30 feet away, Olivia could read the body language. Ferris was defending something. Malloy was dismissing it. And the patient, a 58-year-old woman named Constance Raleigh, was lying there while two people who weren't treating her argued about her treatment. Olivia walked over. She didn't do it to get involved. She did it because she'd been managing Constance Raleigh's IV line for the past hour, and she needed to check it. She was adjusting the drip rate when she heard Malloy say, "The family's already called twice asking why she's not in a room. This is a bed management issue as much as anything," Ferris said quietly. "Her white count is—" "I've seen the white count. I've also seen 17 cases this year where we've admitted based on white count and sent people home 3 days later with a bill they can't pay. This is a sepsis watch, not a sepsis case," Olivia said without looking up. Her map dropped 4 points in the last 40 minutes. There was a pause. "I'm sorry?" Malloy turned toward her. "Mean arterial pressure. It was 74 when she came in. It's 70 now. That's a downward trend, not a stable picture." She was still watching the IV line. "If it drops below 65, we're looking at septic shock. We're not there yet, but I didn't ask for your input." She looked at him then. "I know," she said. "I'm giving it anyway." Dr. Ferris had gone very still. Two other nurses at the station had suddenly become intensely focused on their screens. The ER had one of those invisible membranes where certain conversations carry even when they shouldn't, and this one was carrying. Malloy looked at her for a moment. His expression was the expression of a man recalibrating. Not surprised, because he'd clearly dealt with staff pushback before, but deciding how much to make of it. "What's your name?" "Olivia Shen. I'm one of the ER nurses." "Ms. Shen." He said it with a specific flatness. "I appreciate your concern, but clinical decisions at this level aren't within your scope, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let the physicians manage the case." Dr. Ferris agrees with the concern. I was supporting her assessment. Dr. Ferris and I have already discussed the matter. He looked at Ferris briefly. A look that communicated something Ferris clearly understood because she looked away. Then back to Olivia. "If you have concerns about a patient, you document them and bring them to the charge nurse. You don't insert yourself into a conversation you weren't invited to." She could have let it go there. The math was clear. He outranked everyone in the room, he'd already made his decision, and continuing would cost her more than it would change. She said, "She needs a lactate level drawn." The temperature in the bay dropped by about 5 degrees. Malloy said, "Excuse me?" "Lactate. If it comes back above 2, that's your confirmation. It's a single blood draw. It'll take 20 minutes. She met his eyes steadily. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, we've caught it before it gets significantly worse." For 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Malloy said, "You're done in this bay." "I'm sorry?" "You're reassigned. Right now. Go to triage." He said it the way you'd close a door. "Dr. Ferris will manage this case." Olivia looked at Constance Raleigh, who had her eyes open and was watching all of this with the exhausted, frightened expression of someone who understood that the argument happening above her was about her and not about her at the same time. "Okay," Olivia said. She pulled off her gloves and walked to triage. She drew labs on 4 patients in the next 40 minutes. One of them had a potassium level that needed immediate attention, and she caught it before anyone else looked at the results. She brought it to the covering resident, a second-year named Bautista, who was good when he wasn't overwhelmed, and he thanked her and went to manage it. At 4:41, Dr. Ferris found her at the triage station. Ferris was a few years older than Olivia, efficient, competent, and currently wearing the expression of someone delivering bad news they didn't choose. Raleigh's lactate came back, she said. Olivia waited. 3.4, which meant sepsis, not watch. Case. She's being transferred to the ICU, Ferris added. I ordered it as soon as I got the result. Malloy's... She stopped, started again. He's not happy. I bet. Olivia, Ferris dropped her voice. He's going to write it up. The insubordination thing. He's already talked to HR. Olivia looked up. For suggesting a blood draw? For undermining his authority in front of staff. Ferris looked genuinely uncomfortable. Look, you were right. Everyone in that bay knows you were right. But this is how he works. He doesn't forgive being corrected in public. I know. I can't... Ferris stopped again. There's not much I can do. I'm sorry. Olivia said, Go take care of Raleigh. Ferris went. Olivia went back to triage. The write-up came through official channels at 5:15. A formal notice of unprofessional conduct, citing unauthorized clinical intervention and disruptive behavior in a patient care environment. It was precise and documented, and completely detached from the actual sequence of events, the way these things always were. What came with it, buried in the third paragraph, was a reassignment. Effective immediately, Olivia was removed from the ER rotation and placed on administrative review, pending a meeting with HR scheduled for the following Tuesday. She read it twice in the break room. Then she folded it in half and put it in her bag. She sat there for a minute with her coffee going cold. The break room had a window that looked out onto the hospital's side lot, a view of dumpsters and a chain-link fence, and beyond that, the Delwood skyline going gray in the late afternoon. She'd eaten 1,000 lunches in this room. She'd cried in here once, early in her first year, when a pediatric case had gone badly, and she'd needed somewhere to fall apart for 4 minutes before she went back out. She'd texted her mother from this room and argued with her roommate over something stupid, and once fallen asleep sitting up against the wall when she was 11 hours into a 12-hour shift. She wasn't going to miss it. That surprised her slightly. How clearly she understood, sitting there, that something had just crossed a line that didn't uncross. She pulled out her phone and texted her friend Diane. I'll be early for dinner. Something happened. Then she finished the cold coffee because she'd grown up not wasting things, and that habit had outlasted every situation that shaped it, and went back out to finish the last 2 hours of her shift. While she was 30 minutes from the end when the lobby erupted. She heard it before she saw it. A crash, and then a sound she hadn't heard in years. A sound that her nervous system recognized before her brain caught up. A working dog's alert vocalization, sharp and declarative, not the panicked barking of a frightened animal, but the controlled, precise warning of a trained one. She moved toward it without deciding to. The lobby at Hargrove Memorial was a standard institutional space, rows of hard plastic chairs, a reception desk, a television mounted too high showing a news channel nobody was watching, fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell. At 5:44 p.m., it held maybe 25 people, patients waiting, a few family members, a man sleeping across 3 chairs near the window. The dog was standing in the middle of it. He'd come in through the main doors, propped open because the pneumatic mechanism had been broken for 3 weeks. And he was big, a German shepherd with a working dog build, not the sleeker show dog type, but dense through the chest and shoulders. His coat was dark, mostly black with tan, and he was wearing a vest. Olivia clocked the vest immediately. Military or law enforcement, she couldn't tell which from here, but the material and the fit said professional. He was standing over a man. The man was on the floor by the reception desk. He'd clearly made it through the doors under his own power and then lost that power completely. He was on his side, one arm extended, jacket pushed up to show a forearm wrapped in old bandaging that hadn't been changed recently enough. His color was bad. His breathing, from where Olivia stood, looked shallow and fast. The dog had placed himself between the man and everyone else, and he was holding that position with the absolute motionless certainty of an animal doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Every time anyone moved toward them, he turned his head toward them, and the low, continuous sound started again. The security guard on lobby duty, a young guy named Torres, who Olivia knew slightly, good enough at his job, no more than 24, had his hand on his radio, and was about 40 seconds from calling for backup. She could see it in his posture, the calculation happening in real time, the point at which the animal would become officially a threat rather than just a problem. Two nurses she recognized from the front desk were standing back, watching. One of them, Maya, caught Olivia's eye and mouthed, "What do we do?" Olivia didn't answer that. She was already looking at the dog. She was looking at his vest more specifically. It was dark navy, not the usual tan or black she'd seen most often, and it had specific markings on the left side, a patch she'd seen before, in a context so different from this that the recognition felt like vertigo. A specific insignia, not law enforcement, military working dog, special operations unit. She walked forward. "Hey." Torres saw her. "Shen, I wouldn't." "I've got it." He bit Martinez when she got within. "I've got it." She said it clearly, but not loudly. Not to the guard. She was already crouching, angling herself so she wasn't approaching straight on, making herself smaller. She kept her hands visible and still. She wasn't looking directly at the dog, not meeting his eyes, but keeping him in her peripheral vision the way she'd been taught years ago by a handler who told her that direct eye contact was a challenge, and she didn't want to challenge a dog that could take her arm off. She said something. 2 words, low and specific, in a command cadence that she hadn't used in years. The lobby had gone completely silent. 25 people, not breathing. The dog stopped making sound. He didn't move toward her. He looked at her, his ears shifting forward, his posture changing from aggression to something that was trying to categorize what it was encountering. She said the words again. Then she waited. He took 1 step back from the man on the floor. Olivia moved to the man and touched his neck. Pulse present, rapid, a little thready. And then she looked up at Torres and said, "Get me a gurney and get Dr. Ferris or whoever's up. Now, he's in septic range, minimum. He might be worse." Torres was already moving because something about her voice had changed in the last 60 seconds, and he'd noticed it. The dog sat down beside her. Not away from her. Beside her. He was still watching the room, but his posture had shifted into something that looked, if you knew what you were looking at, like deference. Maya, from 6 feet away, said, "How did you do that?" Olivia was checking the man's pupils. Equal and reactive, which was something. His skin was hot and dry under her fingers. The bandaging on his forearm had an odor she knew, wound infection, moderate to severe. He'd been managing something badly for days, minimum. "Olivia," Maya again, a little higher. "How did you do that?" She was searching his jacket pockets for ID or medical information. She found a folded card in the breast pocket. Via medical card, Department of Veterans Affairs, name Raymond Voss, date of birth 56 years ago. She found something else in the inside pocket. A laminated card, smaller than the VA card, with a unit designation she recognized. She put that one back. The gurney arrived. 2 orderlies and Dr. Ferris, who had been covering when the call came through. Ferris took 1 look at the man on the floor, then 1 look at the dog sitting beside Olivia, and said, "Okay, talk to me." "Raymond Voss, 56. Wound infection on the left forearm, looks at least 3 to 5 days old. Breathing is shallow and fast. I'd put him at 24, maybe 26 respirations. He's hot. He walked in under his own power and went down fast." She was helping them transfer him to the gurney as she talked. "The dog is trained, military working dog. He'll hold if I tell him to. Don't approach him without me." Ferris was already doing her own assessment, hands moving. "What command did you use?" "It doesn't matter right now." That was the second time in 2 hours she'd said something in this hospital that stopped a room. She could feel it. Ferris's pause, the orderly's peripheral attention, Torres still standing nearby processing something he didn't have the context to name. The gurney was moving. Olivia was moving with it, the dog falling into step behind her in a way that made Torres press himself against the wall to let them pass. They got through the ER doors. The fluorescent light hit Voss's face, and Olivia saw it properly for the first time, and felt something go cold and still in her chest. She knew him. She hadn't seen him in 7 years. He was older now, the way everyone was older now, and his face had the weathered compression of someone who'd spent years in the sun and the wind and the particular stress of doing work that didn't go on resumes. But the jaw was the same. The nose. The way his brow sat, even unconscious. She'd worked next to this man in 2 countries. She kept her face absolutely neutral as they moved him into the bay, because 7 years of practice meant she could. But her hands, when she reached for the IV setup, were not entirely steady. The dog stayed at the foot of the gurney. No one tried to remove him. Osasi. They stabilized him in the first 20 minutes. Fluids, blood cultures, preliminary antibiotics, O2 running at 4 liters. His pressure responded, which was good. His temperature was 103.1, which explained the mental status. He needed imaging and he needed more labs, and he probably needed a surgical consult for the wound, which had something happening underneath the skin that the surface presentation was only suggesting. Olivia was in the bay for all of it. She had been officially reassigned. She should have been in triage or given the HR notice, arguably not on the floor at all. Nobody said that. Ferris didn't say it. The residents working the bay didn't say it. The dog, who had moved to a specific corner of the bay and was watching everything without interfering, was the most useful non-medical presence in the room, which was either reassuring or deeply strange, depending on how you looked at it. At 6:22 p.m., Raymond Voss opened his eyes. They were unfocused for a few seconds, the returning from somewhere blink of someone pulling back from unconsciousness. Olivia was charting at the workstation in the corner. He didn't see her immediately. He saw the ceiling first, then the IV line, then the oxygen. Then he tried to sit up, which she caught from the corner of her eye, and she said, "Don't. You're okay. You're in a hospital." He turned his head toward her voice. She watched it happen. The same thing that had happened to her 3 minutes ago in reverse, the same recognition moving across a face she hadn't expected to see. He was 7 years older, and his eyes were feverish, and she was in scrubs in a fluorescent-lit ER bay, and he still knew her in about 4 seconds. "Shen," he said. His voice was a wreck, hoarse and rough and barely above a whisper, but the inflection was there. Not a question, a confirmation. She came to the bedside. She picked up his chart without looking at him and said quietly, "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't say anything right now." She was adjusting his IV rate, making a small correction that didn't need to be made, but gave her something to do with her hands. "You're septic. You're on antibiotics. You have an infection in your arm that we're going to have to look at more seriously." "How bad?" "Bad enough." She glanced at him briefly. "How long has it been like that?" 4 days? Maybe 5? "Why didn't you go to the VA?" He said something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cough. "Started to. Got Ranger to the car, and then he wouldn't get in." "He wouldn't get in, Shen. He sat on the sidewalk and looked at me like I was an idiot." She looked at the dog, who was watching this conversation from his corner with something approaching attentiveness. "Smart dog," she said. "He drove me here." "He doesn't have a license." "Near as," Voss said, and closed his eyes for a second. The effort of those few sentences had cost him something. Olivia stood there. Outside the bay, the ER was moving. Voices and equipment and the controlled hum of a medical system doing what it was supposed to do. Inside the bay was quieter. The dog was watching her. Voss's breathing was steadier than it had been an hour ago. She should page the surgical consult. She should update the chart. She should, in all likelihood, not be standing in this bay at all given what she had in her bag in the break room. "Shen." His voice, eyes still closed. "What?" "You look different in scrubs." "You look terrible in a hospital gown. We're even." He almost smiled. "You never came back." She said nothing to that. "After you separated, we waited to hear. Command said, it said there were circumstances. Nobody told us what. Some people thought you were—" He stopped. "I'm not," she said. "I know. You're here." A pause. Ranger knew. She looked at the dog again. He was still watching her with that particular alert patience that working dogs had, the same expression they wore when they were waiting for the word. 7 years, and he'd recognized her voice in a lobby full of strangers. Or maybe not the voice. Maybe something else. Some frequency of the person that training couldn't account for. She turned back to Voss's chart. She had documentation to write and a surgical consult to request, and a formal reassignment notice sitting in her bag that meant, technically, she was already on borrowed time in this department. None of that was as urgent as the thing that had just started moving at the back of her mind. The connection she was beginning to trace. The reason Raymond Voss, of all the people who could have walked into a Delwood emergency room, had walked into this one. She was good at patterns. She'd always been good at patterns. And this one was beginning to look like it wasn't an accident. Outside, through the narrow window set high in the bay wall, Olivia caught a flash of something. Lights, moving fast. The specific configuration of military vehicles, not local police, not highway patrol, moving through the Delwood evening toward Hargrove Memorial. She stood very still. Then she paged the surgical consult, pulled up Voss's chart, and started writing. Her notes were detailed and meticulous and gave away nothing about what she'd just seen outside. But her hands had stopped trembling because the strange calm that used to come over her before things got serious had settled back into her chest like it had never been gone. Whatever was coming through those doors, she was going to be ready for it. The surgical consult came back in 12 minutes, which was faster than usual, and the surgeon, Dr. Okafor, a compact woman who moved like she'd already decided what she was going to do before she walked into the room, took one look at Voss's forearm and said, "That needs to be opened tonight." "I know," Olivia said. "You're not the attending on this case." "I know that too." Okafor looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to spend energy on a side issue. She decided not to. "Get me the wound culture results when they're back, and make sure he's got a type and screen on file. We're going to need the OR sometime in the next 2 hours." She left. Voss, who had been awake for this exchange, said, "She seems fun." "She's excellent. That's better than fun." He shifted against the pillow, wincing when his arm moved. The IV antibiotics were running, and his temperature had dropped 1.5 points, which was something, but the infection had been sitting in that forearm for too long, and Olivia could see from the discoloration spreading toward his elbow that it wasn't waiting on anyone's schedule. "How long have I been here?" "About 90 minutes. "And you've been here the whole time?" "I work here." "You were reassigned," he said. "I heard the conversation outside." She looked at him. "You were unconscious." "I was in and out. Fever dreams are weird." He studied her face with the particular attention of someone who'd spent years learning to read people in environments where reading people wrong had consequences. "How bad is the situation with the administrator?" "It's manageable." "That means it's not manageable, and you don't want to talk about it." She almost said something sharp. Didn't. 7 years, and he still had that quality. The ability to hold a mirror up without being unkind about it. "I called a patient intervention correctly, and the VP of clinical operations didn't like how I did it." "In front of people?" "Yes. And now he's making it a you problem instead of a him problem." "That's the general shape of it." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Same as always," he said, mostly to himself. She wasn't going to ask what that meant. She knew what it meant. She'd been watching that pattern her entire career. In the military, in civilian medicine, in every room where someone with authority treated competence as a threat rather than a resource. She'd never figured out a clean solution to it. She'd mostly learned to work around it, and occasionally she got tired of working around it and said the things she wasn't supposed to say, and then she was standing in a break room reading a formal HR notice. She checked his temperature again. 101.9, still coming down. Shen. He said her name differently this time. Not the confirmation of recognizing her, not the casual address of someone picking up a conversation interrupted years ago. There was a weight in it. "Why is Ranger here?" "You brought him." "I mean, why did he bring me here, specifically?" He watched her face. "He's been to the VA 3 times this year. He knows the route. He knows the parking lot. But today he didn't want to go there. And he didn't take me to any of the urgent cares, and Hargrove Memorial isn't on any route I drive regularly. He's a trained animal, not a GPS. So the question is why?" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She was looking at the window. The lights she'd seen earlier were gone now, but that didn't mean anything. Military vehicles didn't park in hospital lots with lights running. They went dark and they waited. "You need to tell me why you were in Delwood," she said. Voss said nothing. "Ray? That's a complicated question. Then give me the complicated answer. Quickly, please. Because we don't have a lot of time before someone comes in here and the conversation becomes impossible." He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Ranger, who was watching him from the corner with the patient, unreadable focus of a dog waiting to be told what to do. Then he looked at Olivia, and she saw something shift in his face. The particular expression of a person deciding to trust someone with something they'd been carrying alone. "There's a name," he said. "In this hospital, someone on staff. I was given an address in Delwood 3 weeks ago as part of something I can't fully explain right now, and the address was 3 blocks from here. And then I got sick and I needed a hospital, and Ranger." He stopped. I think he remembered the address, or the proximity. I don't know how else to explain it. "What name?" He told her. She stood very still. Then she said, "Write it down. Don't say it again." She handed him the chart clipboard, and he wrote it in the margin of the paper, small and careful, and she looked at it for 3 seconds, and then folded the paper over so the name was hidden. She had heard that name before. Not here, not in Delwood, in a different context, in a file she wasn't supposed to have seen, in a briefing room she wasn't supposed to have been in, at the end of something that had cost 2 people their careers and 1 person a great deal more than that. She said, "How long have you known?" 6 months? Maybe 7? He paused. "Long enough to come looking. On your own?" The hesitation was brief. "Not entirely." She pulled the paper from the clipboard and put it in her scrub pocket. "Your fever is coming down. Surgery is in 2 hours. You need to stop talking and let the antibiotics work." "Shen, I know," she said. "I know." She checked his IV line one more time, not because it needed checking, but because she needed a moment to think with her hands busy. "Get some rest. I'll be close." She walked out of the bay before he could say anything else, and the dog watched her go with his ears forward and his head slightly tilted, like he was trying to decide whether to follow. Damped. She found Maya at the nursing station and told her to keep a close eye on Voss's vitals and to page her if anything changed. Maya gave her a slightly uncertain look and said, "Aren't you technically not supposed to?" "Page me if anything changes," Olivia said, and Maya nodded. The ER was in its early evening rhythm. The shift change not quite arrived. The incoming and outgoing staff in that 40-minute overlap, where 2 teams were technically responsible for the same patients, and the handoff notes were either meticulous or disastrous, depending on who'd written them. Olivia moved through it without appearing to move with any particular purpose, which was a skill she'd developed in environments where appearing purposeful drew attention. She went to the locker room. She changed out of her ER scrubs and put on the clean set she kept in her bag. She always kept a clean set, another habit from a life where you changed clothes in worse places than a hospital locker room. She sat down on the bench and opened the HR notice again. She read the 3rd paragraph. Effective immediately, removed from ER rotation. Administrative review. Tuesday, 9 a.m. Today was Thursday. She had 5 days in theory. She folded the notice and put it back. The name Voss had written on the chart paper was sitting in her pocket. She didn't take it out. She already knew it. She was turning over the implications of knowing it in a way that was like carefully moving something unstable. You didn't rush. You thought about where each piece was resting before you touched it, because if you moved wrong, the whole structure came down at once. She'd been at Hargrove Memorial for 2 years. In 2 years, she'd watched this hospital operate with a specific kind of institutional dysfunction, the kind that wasn't accidental, the kind that required maintenance, documentation anomalies that kept appearing in patient files, cases that were managed in ways that didn't quite match standard protocols and were never reviewed, staff who raised concerns and were quietly reassigned or quietly let go. She'd noted all of it. She'd documented some of it in personal files she kept at home, not because she had a plan, but because writing things down was how she understood them, and because something in her training had made her incapable of watching a pattern form without keeping track of it. She hadn't understood the pattern until now. She stood up. She put her bag in the locker, took out her phone, and sent a text to a number she hadn't used in 14 months. Just 3 characters. A question that wasn't a question. Then she went back to the ER floor. Otab. It was Dr. Holt who found her first, which was either bad luck or not luck at all. He was coming out of Bay 2 when he saw her at the station, and his expression moved through recognition and then irritation in quick succession. "You're not supposed to be on the floor." "I'm monitoring a patient I brought in." "You didn't bring in anyone? You're a triage?" He caught himself. "You're on administrative hold. That means you're not treating, you're not monitoring, you're not in patient areas. You go home or you go to the waiting room." She could see over his shoulder that Maya was watching this. 2 other nurses had gone very still. The same membrane as earlier, conversations that carried in the ER, the invisible audience that formed whenever authority was being wielded in a corridor. "The patient in Bay 7 has a wound infection that's going to OR in 2 hours, she said. "He has a working dog in the bay that staff hasn't been able to approach. I'm the only one in this building who can handle the animal. Animal control can handle it." "You could call animal control," she agreed. "They'll take about 45 minutes to arrive, during which the dog will prevent anyone from getting close enough to prep the patient for surgery, and your surgical slot will be missed and rescheduled, and the infection will have another 6 hours to move toward his elbow." She paused. "Or I can be in that bay for 2 more hours." Holt looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was right on the technicality and wrong on the substance and knew it. "Malloy will hear about this." "I know." He walked away, which was a form of permission, and both of them understood it. Olivia went back to Bay 7. Voss had managed to sleep, which was what his body needed more than almost anything else right now. His temperature on the next check was 101.1. Ranger was in exactly the same position in the corner, which meant either the dog had phenomenal self-control or had also briefly dozed off, possibly both. She pulled the chair close to the bay entrance, close enough to monitor, far enough to give him space, and sat down. The ER moved around her. An ambulance brought in a man with a broken collarbone from a construction accident, and the bay next door filled with noise and action, and then quieted again. A code was called on the 2nd floor, and the elevator bank lit up with responding staff. The small, ordinary emergency of a hospital on a Thursday evening, the kind of contained chaos that looked like disorder from the outside and was, to people who worked in it, a legible and navigable system. At 7:18, her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen, the number she'd texted, a single word back. Confirmed. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the window. Still dark outside. Still nothing visible. At 7:31, she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the air, the particular shift that happened when something was about to happen and hadn't yet. She'd learned to trust that feeling. It had never been wrong. She was standing up when the first vehicle turned into the lot, and she could see it from the bay window. A dark SUV, government plates, moving with the controlled speed of people who weren't in a hurry because they'd already made all their decisions. It pulled to the side, not the main entrance, and a second vehicle followed it. And a third, not 3. 4. 4 vehicles. She sat back down. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she usually wasn't. Steady, but deliberate, like a piece of machinery that was running properly because it was being manually maintained. Voss stirred. "Shen." "I know." "How many?" "4. A long pause. "That's more than I expected." "That's because you only knew part of it." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Even feverish, even in a hospital gown with an IV in his arm, the operational calculation was happening behind his eyes. "What's the part I don't know?" She looked at him. She thought about saying something careful and partial, the way she usually did when a situation had more dimensions than someone else could see. She decided against it. "The name you gave me," she said, "it's not just one person. It's a system, and it's been running longer than either of us realized." Voss was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "I had pieces of it. I didn't have the center." She looked toward the door of the bay. "Your name gave me the center." Outside, the ER entrance doors opened and the sound of boots on linoleum came through. Not hurried, not aggressive, but definitive. People who knew where they were going and didn't need to ask. Ranger stood up. Not aggressively. He didn't make a sound, didn't square his stance. He simply rose from the floor and turned toward the door with the alert, ready posture of an animal that had been lying in wait and now understood the wait was over. His ears were forward. His tail was still. Olivia said the word, the same word she'd used in the lobby. And he sat, but he stayed watching the door. Shen. Voss's voice had changed. Something in it that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite urgency, but was adjacent to both. Tell me you have a plan. She was looking at the door. I have the beginning of one. That's not a plan. I know. She picked up Voss's chart from the bedside stand and held it in both hands. But the beginning is sometimes enough to work with. The boots in the corridor got closer. She stood up straight. She arranged her face into the particular neutrality she'd learned to wear in briefings, in operating theaters, in every room where projecting calm was itself a form of action. The chart in her hands, the paper in her pocket with the name on it, the patient behind her and the dog beside her, and the HR notice folded in a locker 20 feet down the hall. The bay curtain moved. A man in a dark uniform with no visible insignia stepped through. Then another. The first one was tall, mid-40s, with the build of someone who'd been operational and hadn't entirely stopped being operational, and he was looking at Olivia with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not hostile, not warm, something in between that felt like assessment. Is there an Olivia Shen on staff here? He said. She said, That's me. He looked at her for a moment with a focus that went past professional into something more careful, more specific, like he was checking something against something else he already had. He said, We're going to need to speak with you, privately. From somewhere behind her, she heard Voss exhale, a long, controlled breath that could have been relief or resignation or the sound of someone who'd been carrying something heavy, finally setting it down. She said, All right. And at that precise moment, her pager went off. She looked at the screen. Bay 3. Maya's number. The message was 4 characters. Now. She looked at the man in the uniform. He was waiting. The second one behind him was waiting. They had not moved from the curtain. She looked at the pager again. Bay 3 was the sepsis patient. Constance Raleigh, who'd been transferred to the ICU 3 hours ago and should not, under any circumstances, have been paging this number from Bay 3. Unless she was back in Bay 3. Unless something had gone wrong. Unless Malloy had done something that only made sense if he already knew these vehicles were in the parking lot and needed something covered before anyone started asking questions. She looked at the man in the uniform and said, Give me 2 minutes. He said, Ms. Shen. 2 minutes. She was already moving. She was moving before the man in the uniform finished her name. The corridor from Bay 7 to Bay 3 was 40 feet. A straight shot past the nursing station and 2 procedure rooms, and she covered it in about 8 seconds without running. Running in a hospital corridor drew attention, and attention would slow her down. She pushed through the bay curtain and stopped. Constance Raleigh was back in Bay 3. She was in a different state than she'd been 3 hours ago. The ICU transfer had clearly happened. There was a different IV line in her arm, a central line that hadn't been there before, the kind they placed upstairs when someone needed more reliable access. But the monitoring equipment reading her now was the ER equipment, the older stuff, and her numbers were not good. BP 84 over 52, heart rate 118 and irregular. Oxygen saturation 91 on 2 liters, which meant the 2 liters wasn't enough. Maya was at the bedside with the expression of someone who had been holding a situation together by sheer force of will and was very glad to see reinforcement. She came back down 20 minutes ago, Maya said, low and fast. Transfer order was reversed. I don't know by who. The note in the chart just says attending discretion, and the attending listed is Holt, but I called Holt and he says he didn't write it. Olivia was already at the bedside, her hands moving. Pulse. Rapid, weak, irregular, in a pattern that wasn't the normal irregular, something that had shifted. Where's the ICU team? I paged, no response yet. How long? 11 minutes. 11 minutes for an ICU page with these numbers was not acceptable. She looked at the chart, the actual paper chart that someone had attached to the bay clipboard, which was strange because Hargrove Memorial had gone mostly electronic 18 months ago, and paper charts were supposed to be supplemental, not primary. Someone had written a medication note in handwriting she didn't recognize, ordering a diuretic at a dose that made no sense for a septic patient with a pressure of 84/52. Diuretics pulled volume. You did not pull volume from a patient whose pressure was already in the basement. She looked at Maya. Was this given? Maya looked at the chart. Her face changed. I don't know. It was on the chart when she came down. Check the IV bag. Maya checked. She turned back to Olivia and said, There's a secondary line running. I thought it was the one from upstairs. It wasn't from upstairs. The bag was different, smaller, clear, already a quarter empty. Olivia reached up and clamped the secondary line. She did it calmly, the way you'd turn off a faucet, and then she said to Maya, Get me a bolus setup, normal saline, wide open, and page Dr. Ferris directly, not through the system. Call her cell. I don't have her. I do. She gave Maya the number from memory. Go. Maya went. Olivia stayed at the bedside and watched Constance Raleigh's face, still unconscious, or close enough to it, her breathing the shallow and effortful breathing of a body working harder than it should have to. The sepsis was the foundation, but something had been added to it, something that had taken a patient who was stabilizing upstairs and turned her into this. She was thinking about the name on the paper in her pocket. She was thinking about timing. She was thinking about 4 vehicles in the parking lot and a man in a dark uniform asking for her by name, and a VP of clinical operations who had been down to the ER earlier today for reasons that hadn't been entirely explained, and a medication note in handwriting that didn't match any staff member she could identify. She took out her phone. She photographed the chart. She photographed the secondary IV bag and its label. She photographed the line running from it. Then she put her phone away and focused on Constance Raleigh. Because the woman was still septic and still in a body that needed help right now, regardless of the machinery operating around her. The saline bolus took 3 minutes to set up and another 10 to start showing results. Pressure came up to 91/60, which was still not where it needed to be, but was no longer immediately catastrophic. Oxygen saturation climbed to 94. Heart rate stayed elevated, but the irregular pattern shifted back towards something more manageable. Dr. Ferris arrived at 11 minutes, slightly breathless, still in her coat. What happened? She said, and Olivia told her, not everything, not the photograph or the paper in her pocket, but the clinical sequence, the reverse transfer, the mystery medication note, the secondary line. Ferris listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Olivia had always respected about her, and then she looked at the chart and at the IV bag, and her expression went through several stages in quick succession before settling on something that was controlled and cold. I didn't reverse the transfer, Ferris said. I know. Holt says he didn't either. I know. Ferris looked at her. You know what this looks like? Yes. Olivia, if someone deliberately... She stopped herself. The sentence was large and she was feeling its weight. We have to call the patient safety officer. We do. But first she needs a cardiology consult because her rhythm is still concerning. And she needs the ICU team down here to reevaluate the transfer. And she needs someone staying with her who isn't going anywhere. She met Ferris's eyes. That's you. I have to go deal with something else. Ferris started to say something. Then she looked past Olivia at the bay entrance and said, Who are they? Olivia turned around. The man in the dark uniform was standing at the edge of the bay. He'd followed her, which she'd expected. The second one was behind him. They'd stopped at the curtain and hadn't pushed through, which she hadn't quite expected, and that small deference told her something about how they were handling this. She said to Ferris, Stay with her. Don't let anyone alter that chart or remove the IV bag. Photograph everything. Then she walked out of the bay. The man in the dark uniform said his name was Garrett. He didn't offer a rank or a unit, which told her plenty. The second one stayed one step back and slightly to the side, the automatic geometry of people who operated in pairs and had done it long enough that it was unconscious. She said, How long have you been outside? We arrived at approximately 6:45. You waited 90 minutes before coming in. We were observing the situation. While a patient was being tampered with, he held her gaze. We weren't aware of the situation in Bay 3. She decided to accept that, provisionally. What do you need from me? Garrett glanced at the corridor around them. Not nervous, just procedural, the automatic check of a person who habitually didn't speak in exposed spaces. Is there somewhere private? She took them to the small consultation room off the main corridor, the one that smelled like old coffee and was used for family notifications and occasionally for staff crying, and she closed the door. Garrett put a tablet on the table. On the screen was a photograph she recognized, not of herself, but of a location, a building. She'd been in that building once, 7 years ago, during the last week of an assignment that had ended in a way nobody in a position of authority had wanted to formally document. She said, "Where did you get that?" "It's been in an investigative file for 14 months. 14 months, she looked at him. "And you're here now." "We're here now because we have enough to move. We weren't here before because we didn't." His voice was steady and not apologetic, and she appreciated the directness even though the timeline made her want to put her fist through the wall. 14 months. She'd been in this hospital for 2 years, within 3 blocks of whatever had been happening here, and a file had been sitting open somewhere for 14 of those months. "Tell me what you have," she said. "Tell us what you have," he said. "That's why we're here. You've been inside this institution, we've been watching from outside, and there are things we haven't been able to access." She thought about the paper in her pocket. She thought about Constance Raleigh in Bay 3. She thought about the documentation anomalies she'd been cataloging for 2 years in files on her home computer, the ones she'd noted without a plan, the ones that had been assembling themselves into a structure she hadn't been able to fully name until tonight. "The name on this file," she said. "Is it someone currently on staff here?" "Yes." "Give me a rank or a position." Garrett looked at the second man, who gave a small nod. "Senior administrative level. Access to clinical records, financial records, and personnel decisions." She took the paper out of her pocket and unfolded it and put it on the table between them. The name Voss had written. Garrett looked at it. His expression didn't change much, but something around the eyes tightened. "That's not who we were targeting," he said. "I know," Olivia said. "That's the problem." There was a pause. The second man leaned forward slightly. Garrett said, "Explain." "Whoever you were targeting, they're the mechanism. They manage the operation on the ground, authorize things, bury things, make calls about which staff members get pushed out before they see too much." She tapped the paper. "This person is the reason the mechanism exists here, in this hospital, in this city. Your target doesn't move without authorization, and the authorization comes from here." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. She could see him recalculating. "How do you know this?" "Because I've spent 2 years watching this institution, and I've had the pieces, and I was missing the center. Voss gave me the center tonight." She paused. "The things I've been documenting: medication discrepancies, chart alterations, staff removals that don't follow standard procedure, cases that should have triggered mandatory reviews and didn't. None of it made sense as random dysfunction. It only makes sense as a system. And a system this organized, that has been running this long without triggering a regulatory response, needs someone who can manage upward, not just downward." The second man said for the first time, "How long have you been documenting?" 21 months. "Where's the documentation?" "Off-site." She looked at him. "Not accessible to anyone here." Garrett looked at the paper again. "If you're right about this, if the authorization layer is who you're saying it is, it changes our approach significantly." "I know. That's why I'm telling you. It also means—" He stopped. He said it carefully. "It means there may be operational interest in making sure you can't present what you know." She thought about the reverse transfer order, the medication note in the unfamiliar handwriting, the secondary IV line on a septic patient who had been stabilizing and then suddenly wasn't. "I'm aware," she said. She stood up. "I need to check on my patient, and I need to speak to one more person. Give me 40 minutes. Then I'll give you everything I have." "Ms. Shen." Garrett spoke to her back as she reached for the door. "What you've described, if it holds, the scope of this is significant. You understand what it means to put your name on it." She opened the door. "I put my name on harder things than this," she said, and walked out. Derek Malloy was not a man who panicked easily. He'd been managing institutional complexity for 20 years, which was a professional way of saying he'd been managing the distance between what was true and what was documented for 20 years. And he'd developed the particular equanimity of someone who had learned that most threats could be absorbed, redirected, or outlasted. He was in his office on the 4th floor when his phone rang for the 4th time in 12 minutes. He looked at the screen, set it down, and looked out the window at the parking lot below. He'd seen the vehicles arrive. He'd counted them. He'd made 2 phone calls after that, and both calls had gone to voicemail, which was bad. He'd sent 2 texts, and both had gone unread, which was worse. He was working through his options when his office door opened. He'd locked it. He was certain he'd locked it. The lock was a standard institutional lock that required a key card, and the key card reader had given the soft green confirmation beep when he'd pressed it 15 minutes ago. Olivia Shen stood in the doorway. She was still in her scrubs. She had a clipboard in her hand, and she looked, from the outside, like a nurse who had the wrong floor. He almost said, "You're not supposed to be here," before he registered her face, and then he didn't say anything. "Close the door," he said instead. "I'll leave it open." She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She didn't lean back. She sat forward, the clipboard on her knees, and she looked at him with an expression that he couldn't locate in the usual categories. Not angry, not frightened, not performing anything. "There are federal investigators in this building," she said. "I'm aware." "Are you aware why?" He said slowly, "I have some understanding of the matter." I don't think you have full understanding," she said. "I think you have partial understanding, and the parts you're missing are the parts that are most relevant to you personally." He sat back. He was recalibrating. This was not the interaction he'd expected, not the tone, not the confidence. He'd sent an HR notice to this woman 4 hours ago. She'd been functionally removed from the floor. She should not have been sitting in his office with that particular expression. "What do you want, Ms. Shen?" "I want to show you something." She opened the clipboard and laid it on the desk in front of him. It was a printed document, not a chart, not an HR form, but a spreadsheet. Rows and rows of data, dates, patient names or patient ID numbers, medication orders, documentation changes, outcome notes. 18 months of anomalies. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. "I know what these look like," she said. "I've been watching them accumulate for almost 2 years. I've been trying to understand what was generating them." She tapped the bottom of the spreadsheet. "I understand now." He looked up at her. "And what exactly do you think you understand?" "I think you've been managing the surface of something you didn't originate and don't fully control. I think the pressure on you to keep this institution running in a way that accommodates certain external interests has been significant and long-standing. And I think that tonight, when those vehicles pulled into the lot, you made a decision about Constance Raleigh that was catastrophic." He said nothing. "She's going to survive," Olivia said. "We got to her in time. But the medication alteration and the reverse transfer are documented. The chain of authorization is going to be pulled, and when it is, your name will be on a patient harm event during an active federal investigation of this institution." She let that sit for a moment. "That's a different category than administrative misconduct," she said. "That's not an HR matter." The room was very quiet. Outside the office window, the Delwood night was doing what it always did, indifferent to everything. "What do you want?" he said again. His voice was different this time. "I want you to understand that the conversation you need to have is not with me." She stood up. She took the spreadsheet from the desk and tucked it back into the clipboard. "But it needs to happen quickly, because the investigators downstairs have been here for almost 2 hours, and they're not going to keep waiting." She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you knew this was wrong. I think you've known it for a long time. That matters. Not legally, maybe, but it matters." She looked at him directly. "The people who put you in this position used your ambition and then your fear to keep you here. That's not a defense, but it's real." She walked out. She took the stairs back down, because the elevator would put her in the same enclosed space as whoever might have heard she was on the 4th floor, and she didn't feel like managing that at this particular moment. Her legs were steady on the stairs. Her mind was moving fast and clear in the way it did when she was past the point of deliberation and into the point of action, that strange, focused quiet that had first showed up in her during field work and had never entirely gone away. She had 20 minutes of her 40 left. She needed to check Voss, check Raleigh, and get back to Garrett with what she had. She was on the second floor landing when her phone buzzed. A text from Maya. Someone is in Voss's bay. Not staff, not the uniform guys. She was already moving. She hit the ground floor at a near run, the stairwell door banging behind her, and crossed to the ER corridor. Through the window in the bay door, she could see Ranger on his feet, not barking but positioned, full alert, weight forward, between the bed and the bay entrance. On the other side of Ranger, a man in civilian clothes was standing with his back to the window, close enough to the bed that Olivia couldn't see Voss around him. She pushed through the door. Ranger turned at the sound and recognized her in the same instant, his posture shifting from threat to resource, and the man in civilian clothes turned around and she saw his face, and she stopped. She knew him. Not personally, by photograph. From a briefing file she'd seen during the last week of an assignment she had spent 7 years trying not to think about too carefully. He was supposed to be in federal custody. She looked at Voss, who was sitting up in the bed with the effort of someone for whom sitting up was costing something, and his face told her the same thing her gut was already telling her. This was not a coincidence, and the 40 minutes she'd asked Garrett for had just become 0. She said to the man in civilian clothes, in a voice that was completely level, "Step away from the bed." He looked at her. He looked at Ranger. He looked back at her. And then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He held up both hands and said, "I came to turn myself in." Ranger was still at alert. Voss had not moved. The monitors were still reading. "There are federal investigators 40 feet down that corridor," she said. "I know." His hands were still up. "I came here specifically because I knew they'd be here." He looked at Voss. "And because he'd be here. And because the only way this ends correctly is if someone talks first. And I'd rather be that person than the person who gets talked about." She looked at Voss. He gave a fractional nod, which told her he believed this, which was itself limited information because Voss was feverish and had been wrong about people before, as had she. She looked at the man. She looked at his hands. She looked at the door behind her. She pulled out her phone and called Garrett's number. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "You need to come to Bay 7 right now. Bring your partner." She paused. "And call whoever you need to call, because what I have for you is larger than your current file." She ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood between the bed and the door with Ranger at her side, and she waited, and the ER moved and hummed around her the way it always did, the ordinary chaos of a hospital on a Thursday evening, entirely unaware that the center of something had just shifted in a bay at the back of the floor. The boots came down the corridor. She looked at the man with his hand still raised, and she said quietly, "Don't move." Then the curtain opened. What Garrett's face did in the next 2 seconds, the recognition, the recalculation, the controlled shock of a trained person encountering something significantly outside their operational expectations, told Olivia everything she needed to know about how large this had just become. He looked at her. She said, "I told you I had more than you thought." And somewhere on the 4th floor of Hargrove Memorial, a phone rang and rang and rang. And Derek Malloy sat behind his desk and did not answer it. And outside in the lot, the 4 dark vehicles waited. And the city of Delwood moved through its evening without knowing that the building in its center was holding something that was about to break entirely open. The man's name was Philip Crow. Garrett said it the way you said something you'd been looking for in a drawer for a long time and finally found in the wrong drawer entirely, with a particular flattened quality, not surprise, but the recalibration that came after surprise had already passed. He stood in the doorway of Bay 7 for 3 seconds, looking at Crow's raised hands, and then he came in and his partner came in behind him, and the bay was suddenly crowded with people and energy, and Ranger tracking all of it from the foot of the bed. "Sit down," Garrett said to Crow. "I'd rather stand." "I wasn't asking." Crow sat in the chair. He was in his mid-50s, unremarkable in the specific way that people who'd operated in certain professional spaces became unremarkable. The carefully average clothes, the face that didn't offer much, the posture of someone who'd learned to occupy space without drawing attention to it. Olivia had seen his photograph twice, in 2 different documents that technically she hadn't been authorized to read, and both times the photograph had been attached to a name associated with contract work done on behalf of organizations that didn't use their real names. He'd been in federal custody 14 months ago, in connection with something that Garrett's file was evidently tracking. Then he hadn't been. These things happen. Garrett's partner, she still didn't know his name, was on the phone immediately, moving to the corner, his voice too low to catch. Garrett himself was doing the procedural thing, the smooth automatic sequence of someone detaining a person they'd been looking for. Identification, rights, the quiet mechanical language of federal process. Crow submitted to all of it without resistance, which was either compliance or the behavior of a man who'd already calculated that resistance wasn't the play. Olivia was standing back, watching. Voss had lowered himself back against the pillow because sitting up had been costing him and the immediate threat to his person had resolved. His color was still wrong. She checked his IV line, which needed nothing checked because her hands wanted something to do. "Shen," he said. "Your surgery is in 40 minutes, she said. "Don't get too comfortable." He almost managed a smile. "What happens now?" She looked at Crow, who was being walked through the formal identification sequence by Garrett. "Now it gets complicated." "More complicated than this?" "Significantly. Because Crow in this room was the surface. What Crow had come to say, the thing he'd walked voluntarily into a hospital full of investigators to deliver, was underneath, and Olivia had been in enough rooms where people chose to talk first to know that what he had was large enough that the calculated risk of walking into a federal situation voluntarily was worth it to him. People didn't do that for small things. She waited until Garrett had completed the preliminary and looked at her. She said, "He said he came to talk. Let him talk." Garrett looked at her with the expression of a senior federal investigator being told how to run a detainment by an ER nurse. She held his gaze. He looked at Crow. "All right." Crow folded his hands on his knee, a gesture that looked almost academic. "The arrangement with this hospital," he said, "has been running for 11 years. I was the logistics coordinator for the first 6. After that I was—" He paused, selecting words. "A liability, and the arrangement changed in nature." "What kind of arrangement?" Garrett said. "Insurance fraud, initially. Patient billing for procedures that weren't performed, procedures that were performed differently than billed, mortality outcomes that were documented incorrectly to avoid scrutiny of care decisions." He said it flat and matter-of-fact, the way you'd explain a supply chain. That was the first layer. The second layer developed later when the network needed infrastructure. Hargrove Memorial has an air ambulance program, a pharmaceutical distribution contract, and a network of satellite clinics across 3 counties. Those are very useful assets if you need to move certain things without visibility. The room had gone very still. "Move what things?" Garrett's voice was careful. Crow looked at him. "What do you think?" A pause. "I need you to be explicit." Crow was explicit. He was explicit for about 4 minutes, and by the end of it, Garrett's partner had stopped his phone call and was simply listening, and Olivia was standing at the bay window looking at the parking lot because she needed somewhere neutral to put her eyes while she processed the scope of what she was hearing. 11 years, 3 counties. The air ambulance program, which she had seen in action twice, had always thought was slightly overfunded for a hospital this size, had never been able to place precisely in the anomaly map she'd been building. It fit now. It fit in a way that made the last 2 years of documentation suddenly comprehensible as a system. She thought about the patients, the ones who'd been pushed through too fast, billed for things they hadn't received, managed in ways that prioritized throughput over outcome. She thought about the staff who'd raised concerns and been reassigned or let go. She thought about herself this afternoon, standing in a patient's bay trying to get a blood draw ordered, being told she was outside her scope. She turned back around. "The authorization layer," she said to Crow. She took the paper from her pocket again, showing the name Voss had written. "How long?" Crow looked at the paper. 8 years. "And the relationship is operational, not just financial?" "Both." Garrett was looking at Olivia. "You said you had documentation." 21 months of anomalies, chart alterations, medication discrepancies, cases that should have triggered mandatory review and didn't, staff personnel actions that correlate with proximity to the problem areas. She looked at him steadily. "It's organized. It's indexed. I can have it to you within the hour." "It's off-site." "I can access it remotely." He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. Do it. She pulled out her phone and made a call. It rang 3 times and a woman answered. Her friend Diane, who was not actually named Diane, who had never been to the dinner they'd been texting about, whose phone number had been memorized by Olivia 4 years ago for a purpose that had felt theoretical at the time. She said, "The code is 7742. Send everything to the secure address. Tonight." She ended the call. The second man, who had still not introduced himself, looked at her with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something more careful. She'd been assessed in a lot of rooms by a lot of people, and she recognized the quality of this particular assessment. Not hostile, not impressed, something in between that was mostly recategorization. She didn't say anything to it. She went to check on Voss's pre-op prep, because in 25 minutes an OR team was coming for him, and the night's events had not moved that deadline. Shut. The surgical team arrived at 8:47, 7 minutes early. Dr. Okafor came with them, already changed into scrubs, and she looked at the bay. The 2 federal agents, the man in the chair, the dog in the corner, the patient with federal agents on one side and a nurse who'd been removed from the floor on the other, and said simply, "Everyone who isn't part of my surgical prep needs to be outside this bay in 90 seconds. Garrett looked at Olivia. She said, "She means it." He moved. His partner moved. Crow was walked out by the partner, and Olivia stayed for 60 more seconds to say what she needed to say to Voss, because once he went to the OR, it would be hours before she could talk to him, and there were things he needed to know. She leaned down and said it quietly, close to his ear, the way she'd communicated in rooms that weren't private when privacy was necessary. He listened. He closed his eyes while she was talking, not from fatigue, but because he was concentrating, the same way he'd always concentrated, with his whole body still and only his mind moving. When she finished, he said, "Be careful." "I'll be fine." "That's not the same thing." "I know." She straightened. "Come out of the OR in one piece." She patted Ranger once on the head. He allowed it with the dignity of a dog who was tolerating human sentiment, and walked out. What? The next hour was the kind of hour that didn't look like much from the outside. Garrett and his partner set up a temporary operational presence in the consultation room off the ER corridor, the same room that smelled like old coffee, which Olivia found appropriate. A third federal officer arrived, a woman named Reyes, who brought equipment in a case and set up a secure communication terminal on the table, and the room transformed from a family notification space into something that looked considerably more serious. Olivia's documentation arrived at 9:12. She'd had it organized in a way that was meant to be read by someone who understood medical records and administrative systems, with annotations that translated clinical anomalies into plain language. And she watched Reyes's expression change as she scrolled through it. Not dramatically, but the way an experienced person's face changed when they encountered something that confirmed and extended what they already knew. "This goes back further than we thought," Reyes said. "I started documenting when I started noticing. The anomalies predate my arrival." "How did you know to document?" Olivia considered how to answer that. "Old habit," she said. Garrett was on the phone in the corner. Crow was in a second room with 2 officers giving a formal statement. The third vehicle in the lot had been a transport, and it had a purpose now. At 9:38, Olivia's phone buzzed. Maya. "Raleigh Stable. ICU is furious about the transfer situation. Ferris is with the patient safety officer." She showed it to Reyes. Reyes photographed it. This was how the evening was working. Everything documented, everything moving into the record, the slow mechanical construction of accountability that didn't look like anything in real time, but would look like a great deal when it was assembled. She went and stood in the corridor for a moment. The ER was quieter now, the late evening rhythm replacing the earlier surge. Torres was at the security station, and when she walked past, he gave her a look that communicated something between "Are you okay?" and "What is happening?" And she gave him a small nod that was meant to say later, and he accepted it. She was standing at the nursing station updating something in a patient chart, force of habit, the hands finding work, when the 4th floor paged the ER. Not an unusual occurrence. The 4th floor paged the ER when they needed something clinical that couldn't wait for a standard consult request, and it happened 2 or 3 times a week. The charge nurse on duty, a man named Ferreira, who'd come on at 7, picked it up. She watched his face. He listened for about 20 seconds. Then he said, "I'll notify the relevant staff," and hung up. He looked at Olivia. "Administration is requesting a formal meeting," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was in the middle of something he didn't fully have the shape of. The VP of Clinical Operations. He wants all senior ER staff and a pause. He specifically requested you. She said, "When?" "Now." His office. She looked at the corridor toward the consultation room. She could walk in there and tell Garrett, and Garrett would make a decision about whether she went. That was one option. It was the cautious option, the one that kept her inside the structure of what was being built in that room. She thought about Malloy sitting in his office with his phone ringing. She thought about a man who'd been managing the surface of something for years, who'd been used and pressured and had made a catastrophic decision tonight and now knew it. Sometimes the person who needed to be in the room was the person who understood both sides of it. She told Ferreira to let Malloy know she was coming, and then she went to the consultation room and told Garrett, which was the right thing to do even if she'd already decided. Garrett said, "I don't think that's..." He asked for me specifically. That means he wants to say something to me specifically. She looked at him. "Let me go up. Give me 20 minutes. If I don't come back down or contact you, come up. We should be in the room." "Not yet. If you walk in there now," he lawyers up and says nothing. "And what's in my documentation plus what Crow has given you is solid, but it's cleaner with a direct statement." She paused. 20 minutes. Garrett looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at her documentation on the screen and said, without looking up, "She's right about the evidentiary structure." Garrett said, 20 minutes. Malloy's office had changed in the 2 hours since she'd last been in it. Not physically, the desk, the window, the view of the parking lot where the 4 dark vehicles were still visible, but the quality of the air had changed. The 4th floor was quiet in a way that institutional buildings got quiet after hours, the kind of quiet that made footsteps too loud, and Malloy was standing at his window when she came in, not sitting at his desk. He'd been a tall man when she'd seen him this afternoon. He seemed shorter now. Not physically. He was the same height, but the posture had compressed. She closed the door. She sat in the chair. She waited. He didn't turn from the window. "I've been in healthcare administration for 22 years, he said. She didn't respond to that. "I came up through legitimate operations. I ran 2 hospital systems before this one. My record before Hargrove is..." He stopped. "It's clean. That's what I want you to know." It was clean. I believe you," she said. She did, actually. It was consistent with everything she understood about how these arrangements worked. You didn't find the corrupt from the start. You found the ambitious, and you applied pressure at the right moments, and you waited. The first ask seemed reasonable. He finally turned from the window. His face was tired in a way that looked structural rather than temporary. "Expedite some transfers. Adjust the documentation on some billing codes. The kind of thing that happens in every hospital system. The kind of gray area that..." He stopped again. It didn't stay gray. It never does. "No." He looked at his hands. "It never does. And then you're in it. And the alternative to staying in it seems worse than continuing. And then you're in it differently, and the alternative seems even worse, and..." He made a gesture that wasn't quite a shrug. It was more like something collapsing. "The patient tonight, Mrs. Raleigh. She's stable." He closed his eyes. When I came down to the ER this afternoon, I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was managing bed pressure. That's what I told myself." He opened his eyes. "Tonight was different. Tonight someone called me and said there were investigators in the building and asked me to make sure a specific patient couldn't give a statement." She felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise. Something colder and more specific. "Who called you?" He looked at her. "I think you already know." She did know. She'd known since she'd seen Crow in Bay 7, since she'd heard him begin to describe the scope of it, since the name on the paper had connected to the name in the briefing file she'd read 7 years ago in a room she wasn't supposed to be in. "Say it," she said. "Harlan Burke," he said. The name landed in the room like something physical. Harlan Burke. Not an administrative functionary, not a mid-level operator. Burke had been in the file as a peripheral figure, someone connected to the network by association rather than direct action, someone whose name appeared in footnotes. The authorization layer, she'd called it, and she'd thought she understood what that meant. She hadn't understood fully. "He's not just authorizing," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "He built it," Malloy said. "Hargrove Memorial was his design. The satellite clinics, the air ambulance contracts. He structured all of it years before I arrived. I thought I was running a hospital. I was running an infrastructure." She sat with that for a moment. "Is Burke in Delwood?" she said. Malloy hesitated. "He was. As of this evening." She stood up. "Write it down. Everything you just told me. Put it on paper, right now, dated and signed. You'll be giving a formal statement to the investigators downstairs, and everything you say verbally will need to be documented. But I want something in your handwriting before we go down there, because handwriting is harder to disclaim than a typed document." He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man assessing whether what was being offered was actually what it appeared to be. "You're not going to help me," he said. Not bitterly, just as an observation. "I'm not going to help you avoid consequences," she said. "But the difference between someone who cooperates fully and provides material assistance to an investigation and someone who lawyers up and says nothing is significant, that difference is real, and it's yours to make." He sat down at his desk. He pulled out a notepad. He started writing. She stood at the door and watched him write, and she thought about 22 years of clean record followed by the slow erosion of someone who'd made a reasonable choice that wasn't reasonable, and then another, until the choices weren't choices anymore. She didn't forgive it. The woman in Bay 3 with the tampered IV line was not forgivable, but she understood the mechanism. She'd seen it before, in different institutions and different uniforms, and understanding it was different from excusing it. He wrote for 6 minutes. He signed it. He pushed it across the desk. She took it. She didn't read it in front of him. She put it inside the clipboard. She said, "Come downstairs." He came. Oh. She took him to Garrett at 10:14. She handed Garrett the handwritten statement. She watched Garrett read it, the controlled face again, the tightening around the eyes. And then she stepped back and let the process move forward without her. The process, once it moved fast. Reyes was on the secure terminal. Garrett was on the phone with someone she couldn't hear. The third officer, whose name she'd still not caught, was coordinating something with the vehicles in the lot. Crow's statement and her documentation and Malloy's handwritten account were assembling into something that, from the outside, looked like bureaucratic activity and was actually the framework of a federal action. She sat in the corridor on a chair outside the consultation room and drank a cup of coffee that Maya brought her without being asked. Maya sat down next to her for a minute. "Is it over?" Maya asked. "Some of it." "The part that involves people coming after patients?" "That part's over." Maya nodded. She looked down the corridor toward the OR suite, where somewhere behind sealed doors Raymond Voss was having his arm opened and cleaned and repaired. "The dog is still in the bay." "I know." "He won't eat the food Torres offered him." "He's working," Olivia said. "He doesn't eat when he's working." Maya absorbed this with the equanimity of a person who'd spent years in an ER and had recalibrated her threshold for unusual considerably downward. She went back to the station. Olivia finished the coffee. She thought about Harlan Burke, who was somewhere in Delwood tonight, who had made a phone call to Derek Malloy 3 hours ago asking for a patient to be silenced, who did not yet know that Malloy was downstairs giving a formal statement to federal investigators. She thought about the briefing file, about the things she'd seen in the last week of her last assignment that had ended her military career quietly and completely, the things she'd never been able to speak about in any official context because the people with the authority to investigate it were connected to the people who'd done it. She'd left. She'd come to Delwood, specifically and deliberately, though she'd told herself for 2 years it was proximity rather than purpose. She'd taken a job at a hospital 3 blocks from an address she'd memorized from a document she'd photographed covertly in a room she wasn't supposed to be in. She'd been watching and waiting and building a case in her personal files for 21 months, and she'd told herself she was just documenting, just keeping records, just noting patterns, the language of someone who wasn't ready to name what they were actually doing. Raymond Voss and his dog had walked through the lobby doors, and the pattern had completed. At 10:52, Garrett came and sat in the chair Maya had vacated. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked down the corridor, the way people looked when they were assembling a sentence. "The name you gave us," he said. "Burke. We have him in our file as peripheral." "I know. Your documentation doesn't include him directly. Malloy's statement puts him at the center. Crow's statement corroborates the structure but doesn't place him in this facility." "I know that too. We need more than 2 statements and circumstantial documentation to move on someone at his level." She looked at him. "I know." He held her gaze. "Is there more?" She thought about the briefing file, the photograph, the operational sequence she'd witnessed 7 years ago and had never been able to formally report, the evidence she'd carried in her memory for 7 years because there was nowhere to put it and no one with authority who was safe to give it to. "Yes," she said. "Is it something you can give us tonight?" She looked at the consultation room door. She looked at the OR corridor. She looked at the clipboard on her knees with Malloy's handwritten statement inside. She said, "There's one more piece you need, and it's not in any file." Garrett waited. "The original setup," she said. "How Burke built the network, what it was built on, who authorized the initial infrastructure. The documentation for that doesn't exist in any recoverable record because it was designed not to exist." She paused. "But I was present for part of it, not as a participant, as someone who was in the wrong place and saw something she wasn't supposed to see and left before she could do anything about it." Garrett was very still. 7 years ago," she said. "The last week of my last assignment. That's why you separated." "That's why I separated," he said carefully. "Evidence based on direct witness testimony from a credentialed military medical officer present during the original construction of a criminal enterprise would close the top of the case," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent light of the hospital corridor was nobody's friend, and his face in it looked tired and precise and certain. "Okay," he said. "I need something first," she said. "What?" She thought about how to say it, because the thing she needed was not the kind of thing that came with guarantees, and she'd been in enough operational context to understand the difference between assurances given by people with authority and assurances that were worth anything. She said, "I need to know that what I'm about to tell you doesn't disappear into the same system that let this run for 11 years. He held her gaze. He didn't offer the easy answer. That was, in its way, the most honest thing he could have done. "I can't guarantee the system," he said. "I can guarantee that I put my name on it." She considered that. A man putting his name on something was a fragile guarantee. It was also, sometimes, the only one available. "All right," she said. She was about to start talking when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost let it go, and then something made her answer. The same instinct that had kept her alive in situations where the instinct turned out to be correct. She said, "Yes." The voice on the other end said, "Ms. Shen, I think we should talk." The voice was measured and unhurried. The voice of a man who'd been doing this long enough that urgency was no longer part of his register. She'd never heard Harlan Burke's voice before, but she'd read enough about him to recognize the cadence. The particular confidence of a person who believed they were still, even now, in control of the situation. She looked at Garrett. He was watching her face, reading the change in it. "How did you get this number?" she said. Burke said, "I've known who you are since you arrived in Delwood, Ms. Shen. I've been watching you, much as you've been watching this hospital." A pause. "I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say before you tell those investigators anything else." Her hand was steady on the phone. Her pulse was not. "I'm listening," she said. And Burke told her something that made the ground shift under 2 years of certainty, something that required her to stand very still and think very fast about which version of the truth she was standing inside. And outside in the lot, the 4 dark vehicles waited, and behind a consultation room door, Reyes was still scrolling through 21 months of documentation, and somewhere in the building, Malloy was formally surrendering the life he'd been maintaining, and none of them knew that the conversation happening in the hospital corridor had just changed what the next hour was going to look like. She listened to Burke for 90 seconds without speaking. He spoke carefully, The way careful people spoke when they believed they held something you needed. Not rushing, not threatening overtly, but constructing the container of the offer before revealing what was inside it. He said he had documentation. He said it was documentation she would want, specifically because it pertained to the final week of her last assignment in a way that would exonerate actions she had never been able to formally defend. He said there were 2 people still living who had signed off on orders during that week, orders that had resulted in outcomes that had ended her military career without a hearing, without a record, without the basic procedural dignity of being told what she was accused of. He said he could give her their names and the documentation to support an official reopening. Then he said, "All you need to do is walk away from that consultation room." She stood in the corridor and looked at the wall in front of her. Scuffed institutional paint, a hand sanitizer dispenser, a poster about flu season that nobody had taken down. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her given everything that had happened in the last 6 hours, about what she actually wanted. Not in the abstract, specifically, right now. She thought about what it would mean to have her record cleared. She'd been carrying the weight of an unofficial disgrace for 7 years, the particular heaviness of something that was never formally stated and therefore could never be formally refuted. It had followed her into every job application, every credentialing review, every room where she'd had to decide how much of her background to disclose and how to explain the gap between decorated service and quiet exit. She'd built a life around that weight, gotten used to it the way you got used to a limp. It changed your gait, but you stopped noticing it until someone pointed it out. The offer was real. She could hear that it was real. Burke was not a man who made false offers. False offers were inefficient, and he was, above everything, efficient. She said, "How long have you had it?" "Long enough that giving it to you now is a gesture of good faith rather than desperation," he said. "I want you to understand that." "I understand it." She paused. "I also understand that you're asking me to stop providing witness testimony that closes the top of a federal case in exchange for evidence that benefits me personally." A slight pause on his end. That's one way to frame it. "Is there another way?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her something. He'd expected her to be harder to reason with, or easier. She couldn't tell which. The offer was genuine enough that he'd thought it would land more cleanly. She said, "Where are you?" I'm not asking to locate you. I'm asking because I want to know if you're watching this building right now, and if you can see those 4 vehicles in the lot, and if you understand that what you're describing, asking a witness to withhold testimony in exchange for personal benefit, is a crime being committed on a recorded line. This time the pause was longer. "You're recording this call." "Garrett is recording this call," she said. She looked at Garrett, who had moved closer when she'd held up one finger to stop him, and who was now standing 2 feet away with his own phone out. "He's been recording since I held the phone toward him 30 seconds after you started talking." The line went quiet. She said, "The documentation you're describing, the exoneration material, I want it. I want my record cleared, and I want the people who signed those orders to be accountable for it. That's real, and it's true." She looked at the floor, then back up. "But not like this. Not because I traded it. If it exists, it comes out in the investigation. It gets entered into the record through proper process. That's the only way it means anything." Burke said, "You're making a mistake." "I've been told that before," she said. "Usually by someone who needed me to make it." She ended the call. She stood there for a moment. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not... Something was moving in there that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. Something that was more like the release of a structure she'd been holding intact through sheer tension. The sudden recognition that she'd been clenching something for 7 years and had just, finally, let go of it. Garrett said, "We got it." "I know." "That's a witness tampering charge on top of everything else, combined with what Crow and Malloy have given us." "I know," she said again. She turned to face him. "Can you trace the call?" "Already running." She nodded. She picked up the clipboard from the chair where she'd set it. She said, "Let's go finish this." They found Burke 40 minutes later, which was faster than she'd expected and slower than she'd hoped. He was at a hotel 2 miles from Hargrove Memorial, a mid-range business hotel, the kind with a parking structure that offered multiple exit routes. the choice of a man who'd been careful for a long time and had planned for contingencies. He'd been in the process of leaving when Reyes's team coordinated with local law enforcement to cover the exits, and the specific failure of his contingency plan was that he'd used a cell phone registered to a subsidiary of an entity in his own network to make the call to Olivia, which was either arrogance or the particular error of a man who'd operated without consequences for long enough that consequences had stopped feeling real. She wasn't there when they brought him in. She was in the ER. She was in the ER because at 11:34 p.m., Raymond Voss came out of the OR. Bokit. He was in recovery for 40 minutes, and then they moved him to a room on the third floor, and Ranger was walked up by Torres, who had, over the course of this long evening, become the unofficial handler of a military working dog with more self-possession than most of the human staff, and who had the slightly dazed expression of a man who'd signed up for hospital security and gotten considerably more than that. And when Olivia came into the room, Voss was awake, barely awake. The particular flatness of someone in the first hour after anesthesia, where the world was real but distant, like a television in the next room. His arm was wrapped. The surgeon had gotten everything. Okafor had told her in the hallway in the precise, unsentimental language of a person who found drama unnecessary. The infection had been extensive, the tissue damage was significant but recoverable, and he would need follow-up care and physical therapy, but the arm was intact and he was going to keep it. Olivia sat in the chair next to the bed. Ranger positioned himself between the bed and the door, which was where he'd been all night whenever there was a bed to protect. "Burke?" Voss said. His voice was thick. "Taken." He closed his eyes. "Malloy?" "Downstairs with investigators. He's cooperating." "Crow?" "In custody. He's been talking for 3 hours." A long exhale. "The patient, the woman, stable, ICU. She's going to be okay." He was quiet for a moment. The monitors beside him ran their steady readings. The hospital around them had settled into its late-night register. Lower voices, fewer footsteps, the deep background hum of a building that never fully stopped. "You gave them the testimony," he said. "Not a question." "All of it." "The weekend—" "All of it," she said. "On record." He opened his eyes and looked at her. He looked at her the way people looked at each other when they'd been through something together that wasn't available in language. Not the easy language, anyway. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and I just put it down, and now I don't know what to do with my hands." He said, "That's about right." "It's not over," she said. "There'll be formal proceedings, depositions. It'll take months, maybe longer. It'll stick." "Garrett thinks so. Reyes thinks so." She looked at the window. "I think so." "Then it'll stick." She wasn't as certain as he sounded, but she understood what he was doing. Not false reassurance, but the deliberate choice to trust the structure they'd built, rather than spending energy catastrophizing the ways it could fail. She'd been doing the opposite for years. Maybe that was worth examining. "Go back to sleep," she said. "Shen." "What?" "You did good tonight." She said nothing to that. Not because it didn't land. It landed, fully, in the specific way that recognition from someone who knew what the night had actually contained landed differently from recognition from people who only knew the surface. She said nothing because the thing she felt at the words was large enough that she needed to let it sit quietly rather than respond to it. She stayed until he was asleep, which took about 4 minutes, and then she sat for a few more minutes in the dark room with the monitors and the dog and the sound of a hospital at midnight. The next morning arrived the way mornings arrived after nights like that, gray and factual, with no particular sensitivity to what had preceded it. Harlan Burke was formally charged at 7:15 a.m. The charges were read to a man who had managed, in the 36 hours since 4 vehicles had pulled into a hospital parking lot, to have the particular look of someone who'd finally run out of contingencies. Not broken, not dramatic, just reduced. The infrastructure he'd built across 11 years had been constructed with the understanding that the people inside it had more to lose from disclosure than he did. That calculation had failed at the specific point where the person who'd been watching from inside had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to wait. Malloy surrendered his administrative credentials at 8 a.m. He did it in the presence of 2 federal investigators and Hargrove Memorial's board chair, who had been called at 6:30 in the morning and had arrived looking like a man who dressed in the dark and hadn't entirely recovered. The formal removal was procedurally clean. The human version of it was not. She heard later from Ferreira that Malloy had sat in his office for 20 minutes after surrendering his key card before someone finally came to walk him out, and that he'd walked past the nursing station on the 4th floor without looking at anyone, which was either shame or the preservation of the last of his dignity, and she suspected it was both. Philip Crow's formal cooperation agreement was signed at 9:45. The scope of what he'd documented in his statement, the 11-year operational timeline, the network of satellite clinics, the air ambulance routing, the billing infrastructure, was the kind of scope that produced, in the investigators, a specific controlled energy that she recognized as the professional version of satisfaction. Something large had been assembled and it was going to hold. She wasn't in any of those rooms. She was in the ER. She was in the ER because she'd come back for the morning shift out of habit or stubbornness, or the simple fact that she didn't know what else to do with herself at 7 a.m., and because Ferris had called her at 6:45 and said, without preamble, "Come in, people need to see you here." She came in. She picked up charts. She worked. Dr. Holt was in the ER when she arrived, and he looked at her with an expression that moved through several phases: discomfort, recalibration, the residue of yesterday's authority now sitting in a different context. He didn't say anything to her. She didn't say anything to him. They worked around each other with the careful geometry of people who'd had an understanding disturbed and hadn't yet worked out the new one. At 10:20, she was at the nursing station when she heard the sound in the main corridor. Footsteps, several people, a quality of movement that wasn't emergency but was deliberate. She looked up. Garrett came through the ER doors. Reyes was behind him. Behind Reyes was a woman Olivia didn't recognize, older, in a civilian suit, with the bearing of someone who held institutional authority but wore it differently than Malloy had worn it. And behind her was a man in military dress uniform, decorated. His posture, the posture of someone for whom the uniform was not costume, but native language. The ER slowed, not stopped. ERs didn't stop, couldn't stop. There were 3 patients actively being treated, and the monitors didn't pause for ceremony. But the quality of attention in the room shifted. Torres, at the security station, straightened without being aware he was doing it. Maya, at the far end of the station, put down what she was holding. The man in the uniform stopped in front of Olivia. He was a colonel. She recognized the insignia. She hadn't been in uniform for 7 years, and some knowledge lived below conscious thought, and this was that kind. He said, "Olivia Shen." Yes. He said her full rank. Her former full rank, the one she'd held before the separation, the one she'd stopped using the day she left because using it felt like claiming something that had been taken. He said it clearly, in an ER corridor in Delwood, Colorado, in front of staff and patients and a security guard who was trying very hard not to stare. "Your service record," he said, "is being formally reviewed and corrected. The circumstances of your separation from service 7 years ago have been re-examined in light of new evidence and official testimony. The determination of administrative misconduct has been vacated." He paused. "On behalf of the branch, I'm here to tell you that we got it wrong and to offer a formal apology." The ER was very quiet. She looked at him. She looked at the uniform and the insignia and the formal language of institutional correction, which was the closest these structures came to saying, "I'm sorry." And she felt the thing in her chest that had moved last night move again, but differently, because last night it had been release and this was something else. This was, she realized, the thing she hadn't been able to name for 7 years. Not vindication. That word was too clean, too simple for something this complicated. More like the restoration of a true record, the correction of something that had been wrong in ways that had spread through her life like a fracture through a bone, quietly structural, shaping everything she put weight on. She said, "Thank you." He extended his hand. She shook it. And then, because she was still herself, because she was constitutionally unable to let a moment be only what it officially was, she said, "Is there something I should sign?" Or, he almost smiled. "There will be paperwork." "There's always paperwork," she said, and behind her she heard Ferris make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and landed somewhere honest in between. The woman in the civilian suit was from Hargrove Memorial's board. Her name was Patricia Leung, and she had the efficient directness of someone who'd spent 30 years in nonprofit governance and had learned that hesitation in a crisis cost more than action. She found Olivia 20 minutes later, after the Colonel and Garrett and Reyes had taken their procedural movements elsewhere and the ER had returned to its functional noise. She said, "The board convened an emergency session at 6 this morning. I heard. We're going to need significant restructuring, administrative leadership, clinical oversight, compliance infrastructure." She looked at Olivia directly. "We're also going to need people who understand what went wrong here and why." Olivia said, "I'm not an administrator." "We're not necessarily looking for an administrator." Leung was precise. "We're looking for a clinical operations advisor, someone who can sit between nursing staff and institutional leadership and function as a check. Someone whose first instinct is the patient." Olivia looked at the ER around her. The bays, the station, the flickering overhead light in the corridor that facilities had been promising to fix for 3 months. The chart in her hand. The 14 years of training and practice and institutional observation that she'd been applying for 2 years to a system that had been designed to absorb and neutralize exactly the kind of attention she paid. "What does the role actually involve?" she said. "We can discuss that," Leung said, "but I want to ask you something first." "Go ahead." "Why did you stay? 2 years in a system with these problems. Most people would have left." Olivia thought about it. She thought about all the careful answers she could give: professional obligation, patient advocacy, the documentation project. All of those were true. She said, "Because leaving is easy, and I've been good at leaving. I left the military, I left the places after that, I left every situation where it got complicated enough that the cost of staying outweighed the..." She stopped. "I didn't want to leave again. I wanted to stay somewhere long enough to see it through." Leung looked at her for a moment. "Did you?" "We'll see," Olivia said. "Ask me in 6 months." Leung almost smiled. "Fair enough, boss." She visited Constance Raleigh at 2 p.m. Raleigh was in the ICU, awake, the particular frail alertness of someone a few days away from a crisis. The room was quiet. A family member, a daughter, from the resemblance, was in the chair by the window and stood when Olivia came in, uncertain whether this was good or bad news arriving. "I'm one of the ER nurses," Olivia said. "I was with you yesterday evening." Raleigh looked at her. Her voice was thin but steady. "You're the one who caught the blood pressure." "Yes. The doctor told me there were some..." She hesitated, looking for the word. "Complications. With my care last night." Olivia said, "There were. They've been addressed." "Addressed." Raleigh turned the word over. "Will you tell me what that means?" "It means the people responsible for what happened to you are no longer in positions where they can make those decisions. And it means you're going to receive a formal notification from the hospital within the next 2 weeks about your rights as a patient and your options going forward." Raleigh looked at her for a moment. "Are you telling me someone tried to hurt me on purpose?" Olivia didn't flinch away from the question. Raleigh had earned a straight answer. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were a witness to something, and someone was afraid of what you might say." Raleigh absorbed that. The daughter by the window had gone completely still. "And the someone," Raleigh said, "is being dealt with." "Yes." Raleigh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've had 3 nurses in this hospital in 24 hours who treated me like a person and not a problem. You were the first one." She looked at the IV line in her arm, the monitors, the evidence of a body that had almost not made it. "I'd like to know your name." "Olivia Shen." "Olivia." She said it once, carefully, the way you said a name you wanted to remember. "Thank you." Olivia walked out of the ICU into the 3rd-floor corridor, and she stood there for a moment with her back to the wall, and she let herself feel the full weight of the night before. Not the investigation, not the testimony, not the colonel's handshake, but this specific thing. A woman alive and asking questions and knowing her name. That was the unit of measurement that mattered, not the case, not the charges, not the record correction or the new role or any of the institutional machinery turning toward accountability. This woman alive, that specific fact. She'd come to Delwood 2 years ago with a file and a purpose she'd been pretending to herself was just documentation. And what she'd found was that the thing she'd thought she wanted, the exoneration, the record, the official acknowledgement that she'd been right, was real and it mattered, but it wasn't the center. The center was this: being in the room where someone needed exactly the knowledge she had and using it. She'd known that once, at the beginning, before the machinery of institutions had begun its slow work of making her forget. She was at the nursing station at 4:30 when she heard the sound of claws on linoleum. Ranger came down the corridor with Torres, who had the slightly stunned expression of a man who'd been asked to walk a dog and had spent the last 20 minutes being stared at by everyone in the building. Voss was being moved to a lower acuity room and the dog had gotten restless, and Torres had volunteered because at this point the animal was the most coherent thing in his day. Ranger stopped at the station and looked at Olivia with those amber eyes, the same deliberate attention he'd been paying her since the lobby. She crouched down. She looked at him. "Good job," she said. It was what you said to a working dog who had done what he'd been trained to do. He accepted it with the dignity of a professional. He pushed his nose briefly against her hand, just once. Then he sat back and looked at the corridor like a dog who had work to do. She stood up. Yet, the formal charges against Harlan Burke were filed at 5 p.m. and made available to the press by 5:30. The Delwood news cycle, which had been running a vague story about federal activity at a local hospital all day, got the details in the early evening broadcast: 11 years, 3 counties, insurance fraud, controlled substance trafficking through medical infrastructure, and at the top of the document, in the precise language of federal criminal complaint, a sentence that described the knowing endangerment of patients as a means of suppressing witness cooperation. She didn't watch the broadcast. She heard about it from Maya, who texted her a screenshot with the single comment, "Whole building is watching the TV in the break room." She was in Voss's new room. He was sitting up, which was progress, his arm in a proper dressing now, and his color closer to the color of a living person than it had been yesterday. Ranger was on the floor. The television in the room was off. He said, "Burke's going to have the best lawyers in the country." "He is," she said. "It'll take years." "It will. And you still did it." She looked at the window. Delwood at evening, the city going gold and gray in the late light. She'd come here 2 years ago for a reason she'd dressed up as accident, and she was still here, and the thing she'd come to do was done. And she didn't entirely know what the shape of what came next looked like. That was all right. She'd figured out the next thing before. She'd figure it out again. "Can I ask you something?" Voss said. "You're going to ask it anyway. Was it worth it? The 7 years. The waiting." She thought about every room she'd been quiet in, every correction she'd made that someone above her had overridden. Every morning she'd come to work in a building she knew was broken and done the work anyway, because the work was the work regardless of the building. Every patient whose name she'd remembered, every chart she'd flagged, every time she'd watched someone be dismissed and had felt the recognition of that, and had stayed anyway. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a year." He said, "That's not a no." "No," she said, "it's not." Outside, the sun was doing what it did in Colorado in the early evening, hitting the peaks at a low angle and turning the light copper and specific, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they meant something. The hospital sat in the middle of the city, and the city sat in the middle of the mountains, and somewhere in it the machinery of accountability was doing its slow, imperfect work. She'd put her name on it. That was what she'd done. 7 years of carrying something alone, and she'd put her name on it in a room that smelled like old coffee, and the weight had not vanished. These things didn't vanish, but she was no longer carrying it by herself. That was what nobody told you about the quiet kind of strength. Not that it was painless. Not that it made you invulnerable or removed you from the cost of things. It meant you kept going when the going had a price, and you paid the price without requiring the world to applaud you for it, and you trusted, not naively, not without evidence, but as a deliberate act, that the truth you were carrying would eventually find a room big enough to hold it. She'd found the room. She got up from the chair. She picked up her jacket from the back of it. "Get some sleep," she told Voss. "You've got physical therapy starting day after tomorrow." "Already?" Okafor's approach. He looked at his bandaged arm with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations of the next month. "Shen." She stopped at the door. "What happens to you now?" She put on her jacket. She thought about Leung and the conversation they'd need to finish. She thought about the formal military review and the paperwork the colonel had mentioned, which would take months and be tedious and would be worth every page. She thought about the HR notice still sitting in her locker, which was going to be formally rescinded in the morning and which she was going to take home and keep, not as a wound, but as a record of exactly how wrong an institution could be about a person and exactly what it cost to prove it. She said, "The same thing as always." "What's that?" She looked at him. "The work." She walked out into the corridor where the hospital was doing what hospitals did, holding people at their worst and working to return them to their lives, the daily impossible ordinary of it. And she walked through it the way she always had, without needing anyone to see her, toward whatever came next. Behind her, she heard Ranger settle on the floor with the sound of a dog who decided the situation was stable and he could rest. She thought that was probably right. There are people in every institution who see what others overlook, who flag what others file away, who stay when leaving would be easier, not because they are fearless, but because they have decided that the truth is worth the cost of carrying it. They are rarely the loudest people in the room. They are almost always the most necessary.